They are as close to the center of power as anybody, and yet in most cases, the public doesn't know anything about them or what they actually do. For a better understanding on the duties and responsibilities of a Prime Minister's or Premier's Chief of Staff, we welcome 4 guests who have had that job. In Kingston, Ontario, Senator Hugh Segal, who was Chief of Staff to both Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Premier William Davis. In the nation's capital, David Lindsay, former Chief of Staff to Premier Mike Harris. And here in our studios, Herschel Ezrin, former Chief of Staff to Premier David Peterson, and Peter Wilkinson, former Chief of Staff to Premier Dalton McGuinty. And we welcome you 4 former chiefs, both here and in Points Beyond, to our studio and to Kingston and Ottawa tonight. Let's just establish off the top here that this is going to be a program tonight that is less about the ins and outs of what's going on with Nigel Wright right now, and more about the job, because his situation has obviously given rise to questions about what is it you people did and all of that. So we're going to get into that tonight. And to start with, I'm going to, Herschel Ezrin, use a list that you use because you teach people how to do these jobs in a Seneca College class.
Right.
And I want to, control room if you would, let's put the 5 F's up on screen if we can right now. These are the 5 F's of being a Chief of Staff. Job 1, be a filter. 2, a facilitator. 3, a fixer. 4, maybe the face, depending on the leader. And 5, focus, driving the leader's agenda. And I'd like to go through these and ask each one of you to perhaps give us some amplification on each and help us understand how you may have performed that role for your respective Premier or Prime Minister. Herschel, the filter, what does that mean?
Well, it really depends where you are. If you're in a provincial situation where you're actually delivering services from a government, part of the challenge is actually knowing how those services are delivered and being able to give good feedback to the leader, not just what they hear from the minister or the ministry, but other kinds of feedback about how that service is being delivered and whether or not it's effective. My best filtering point actually was the sauna in one of the Bloor Street Ys, where I used to go on a Sunday morning and listen to people talk about politics. And now in social media, you know, Twitter gives you some of the flavor, but that face-to-face reality was a very sobering sense for what was actually happening compared to what the government and the Premier of the day thought was happening.
Hugh Segal, when Brian Mulroney wanted you to be the filter, how did that go?
Well, because he was a Prime Minister who really liked the telephone and was on the telephone himself extensively, talking to rank and file, talking to business people, labor leaders and others, I didn't have as much of a role perhaps as might have been the case for Herschel in his circumstance. My role on the filtering side was more like that of an air traffic controller. Which are the planes that are likely to land? Which are the planes we have to get off the ground on this area of policy or that area of government administration? How are they doing in flight? Who are the passengers? And if there's a difficulty landing, what do we have to do? In other words, it gets down to the final F, which is focusing on those aircraft that really mattered, focusing on the ones you had to attend to because there was some challenge or problem. And in Mulroney's case, there was never any need, in a sense, to connect him better than he was already connected. In Mr. Davis's case, interestingly enough, if Mr. Davis had any failings as a Premier, I don't think he had many, but if he had any, he thought too well of people all the time. He was far too trusting, both of people in his own caucus and cabinet and also of the folks who came into the office because they wanted something from the government. And I think part of what you could filter through there was to make sure that when he assessed issues, people, dynamics, he also had a full story so he could come to a conclusion with his cabinet colleagues that was well informed.
Peter Wilkinson, when you had to be the filter for Dalton McGuinty, how did that go?
Well, my filtering, I think, when I was working with Premier McGuinty was very similar to Hugh's. I mean, a big part of my job actually was trying to make sure that what was happening inside the government, you know, it's very complex. There's just so many things happening all the time that you, and people are always trying to get his attention and time. And I think that's a big part of the filtering is managing the time. It's the most precious thing that any Premier or Prime Minister has is their time, and you got to sort of kind of divide up that time and make sure that he's not just, and particularly in Premier McGuinty's case, not only he's doing the job he loved, but he also still wanted to be a good father and a good husband and a good son. And so trying to work all of that in with all the other demands of being the Premier was also a big part of the filtering job.
David Lindsay, you did it for Mike Harris. How did that go?
The wonderful opportunity of working with good, experienced politicians is they're usually pretty good filters themselves. What Mike quite often was able to do is whoever he sat beside coming down on the airplane on Monday morning from North Bay, he would strike up a conversation with them, and he'd come in with a whole bunch of new ideas and a different perspective on things. So it goes back to Hugh's point that the flip side of filter is actually focus. You can't deliver everything and do everything in the limited amount of time you have. So providing a filter on how services are being delivered, as Herschel was pointing out, is very important. When you become Premier, you start to have an OPP delegation around you, you have security, you have a cocoon that unfortunately gets built around you. And Mike always tried to make sure he broke through that and talked to real people. But the flip side is, the more people you engage with, the more diffuse your thoughts become, and then you have to go to the last F, which is focus.
Well, David, let me do a follow-up here, which is, I wonder when you guys had your conversations and figured out, okay, we're going forward with this, and then Mike Harris walks in, having just talked to the barber in the basement of the legislature, and says, "Oh, I got a new idea.
Yes.
You know, the barber said we ought to do this." How much did that drive you guys crazy?
I would go down and talk to Frank and advise him not to give us any more advice. We all know Frank the barber at Queen's Park, those of us that have worked there. He's a great guy, and it was usually pretty good advice, but sometimes it was timing of his advice that wasn't helpful.
Gotcha.
So we
Steve,
promised the Premier that we would follow up on the advice and get back to him.
Hugh Siegel?
Well, it depended, if I may say so, on the idea. Sometimes I would do the famous, Premier, that's very interesting, or Prime Minister, leave it with me. And the other time, however, I remember our Prime Minister, not unlike Premier McGuinty, Premier David, very focused on spending time with family, and he would regularly go to his kids' hockey games at an arena in the north end of Ottawa, in the northwest end of Ottawa, and he'd be there in the afternoons. He'd play hooky from whatever was going on to watch his kid play hockey, and did this on a consistent basis. And one of the games, a bunch of the hockey mothers who were there gathered around him and said that one or two of them were having a difficulty with stalking from ex-husbands, and that the stalking laws they'd been told by their lawyers were not very strong, and he re-emerged in the office at about 5 o'clock before a late cabinet committee meeting and said to me, "Please get the Attorney General in. I think we should be doing something to protect women from exes who are stalking them," and that produced legislation in about 4 weeks' time. So you had to be very careful, but you also had to respect the fact that somebody with the kind of political judgment that a Premier or a First Minister or Prime Minister has, something strikes them as worth further consideration. Most of the time, they're likely right.
Let me just confirm, Senator Siegel, you're talking about Brian Mulroney there, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. I was talking
Okay.
about Prime Minister Mulroney. That's right.
Okay. Let's go to point number 2 on the Ezrin list now of the 5 Fs, and that's facilitator. What does that job entail?
Well, a lot of times you'd have people who wanted to meet with the Premier, and they wanted to be able to advance a particular agenda one way or the other. You had to make sure that they felt, I stress the word felt, that they had access. But on the other hand, you wanted to make sure that the operations of government were such that the Premier was able, and Premier Peterson in this case, was able to fend what were the issues that were really there, what issues should be raised with this group in response. It wasn't that you were just a one-way group, but you were facilitating a kind of discussion. You had to make sure there were everything from briefing notes to very specific answers to why you hadn't done something before that you may have even promised, whether it be in an election campaign or at some other point. And so you had a lot of those activities. And the other part of facilitation all dealt with ministers, because ministers also had their agendas, and they wanted to come in and they wanted to argue the case of why they should be able to do something. And you had to both help them feel that they were being facilitated in terms of being given their opportunity, but at the other hand, making sure that the Premier's wishes were being obeyed.
Peter, I'd love it, obviously, if all of you would spill your guts today and give us some great, previously unknown stories about how this thing actually went down. But can you give us a sense of how you would both facilitate and yet protect, as your story, I think, implies, Herschel, Premier McGuinty?
Well, Yeah, I think one, it's the best example actually is before actually I was his chief of staff, and I was chief of staff to the Minister of Finance at the time, who was Greg Zabera, who I was his chief of staff for about 2 years. One will recall that there was a day in Greg's life where his lawyer called to say that the RCMP were up at Royal Plastics and had served a subpoena, and that they were looking for a series of documents in regards to some criminal activity by that company.
Which he was on the board of.
Which he was on the board of
in his private life.
In his private life before, and he had come off of it when he had become the minister. There came a point where the lawyers had been all through everything, the RCMP had been all through everything, and the lawyers were saying, look, this is, it's a valid subpoena, and you're under investigation. And so I was the one that sort of had to call and to the Premier's office and sort of say, I think this is the moment where Greg's got to step down. And I was the one that had to walk down. I think the most difficult day I ever had in my life was to go and see Greg, who knew, but someone had to go in and say to him, Greg, you have to step down, and you have to step down now. Greg and I had known each other for 20 years, and that was not a great day for me. But I think that's how you facilitate the government, and at that point for the Premier, even though I wasn't working for the Premier.
But interesting, though, that the Premier doesn't deliver that. The Premier appoints him, but the Premier didn't deliver the message that you've got to step down now.
No, he didn't.
Well,
Sometimes they do, but in this case, we knew that we had to do it.
But there are other cases. I remember a case where I was dealing with a minister of mines who unfortunately had not understood that he couldn't invest in mining stock while he was doing it. And we had this discussion, and I was the first, if you knew Mr. Fontaine, you knew he was a good man, but he was very emotional. And so I was the first wave of troops on the beach to try to explain to him why this doesn't work. And I remember him turning to me and he said, but I lost money on all of these stocks. And I said, that's not going to cut it.
We should just clarify, because to complete the story, the RCMP investigated Sorbera, completely exonerated, went back into cabinet
Yeah, the
after
judge
that.
threw it all out.
Right. We just wanted to
If you
close
want
the story.
another example of a facilitation that's quite different, back in the old days when Toronto and Ontario didn't have Sunday shopping. Remember that? And the Peterson government introduced the first legislation. And we had a cabinet that was really quite split on exactly what to do. It's no surprise that the people of the province of Ontario are quite split on what should be done. And so you had different ministers who were trying to articulate the views of their constituents about whether this was offensive to the Lord's Day, or whether this was going to take advantage of workers and all the rest of this. And the Premier came up with a very novel idea. He actually had Ian Scott, the late Ian Scott, who was then the Attorney General, argue both sides of the case at Cabinet as an advocate, first for those who wanted to go ahead with the legislation, and then for those who wanted not to go ahead with the legislation. And everyone felt that their argument had been superbly made by Mr. Scott.
and he could have done both superbly as well.
And he did.
Yeah. Senator Siegel, how about you, the facilitator role?
Well, I think one of the things important around the facilitation issue is whether or not there was a hierarchy in the government. I've read the references to the Chief of Staff in Ottawa as the second most powerful man in the nation. When I worked as Chief of Staff, I would not have aspired or been justifiably given that title. When I worked for Mr. Davis, the second most powerful man in Ontario was the Honourable W. Darcy McHugh, Minister of Finance. When I worked for Mr. Mulroney, the second most powerful man in the country was Don Mazinkowski, the Deputy Prime Minister. So part of facilitation is linking up the different pieces that are necessary to make something happen. I'll give you one example. There was a charity in its very nascent days called Children's Helpline, Children's Help Phone, and it was getting going, and some volunteers had put it together, but they needed a little bit of matching funding. Some companies wanted to help, but they needed some Government of Canada help from the Ministry of Health. So as Chief of Staff, I could call the Honourable Perrin Beatty, the Minister of Health. I could talk to his Deputy Minister, Ian Green. I could talk to his Chief of Staff in the Minister's office, Bill Liaskis. I could get the Privy Council office to take a look at the analysis. And the Minister of Health could announce a grant, which became the basis of a very important social service, which kids can call in any state of difficulty for help and support, the kind of social service that saved people from committing suicide on the Toronto subway because one of the professional social workers who answered the phone was able to connect with the police before something awful happened. So there's that kind of facilitation where sometimes people on the outside of government have to navigate quickly to make something constructive happen, and whatever else may happen when you're chief of staff, people will call you back. And that is a way to make something happen about which you know your prime minister would be proud.
David Lindsay, your effort as facilitator?
All the examples I've heard so far are wonderful. I'll try and put a different spin on it for you, Steve. As you know, the first couple of years of the Harris administration was dominated by quite an ambitious agenda, and we had lots of people who were supporters, and we had a number who were not supporters at the time. So I had a regular luncheon appointment out at the Inn on the Park on the Don Valley next to OFL headquarters with Gord Wilson on a regular basis. Who
Wait a
at that
second,
time
wait a
was the
second.
head of the
This is news
Ontario
here.
Federation of Labour.
Mike Harris's chief of staff met regularly with the head of the Ontario Federation of Labour?
On a periodic basis to make sure they understood what we were doing and we understood what they were doing.
That's called being a progressive conservative, just for historians in the crowd.
Okay.
Doesn't happen these days.
Okay, continue on, Mr. Lindsay.
And Sid Ryan came in and talked with Minister David Tabucci about implementing some of the welfare reforms we had. I sat in on those meetings and tried to see if there was some common ground. So facilitation and helping to bring parties together doesn't necessarily just have to happen within your party, within the caucus, within the cabinet. It's also with stakeholder groups, and I was asked to perform that role a number of times, mainly with advocates who weren't necessarily supporters of the Harris administration.
Gotcha. Herschel Ezrin, number 3F, fixer. What does that mean?
It's when you have a problem. It seems that the people who occupy the position that all of us have been in face one common reality, and that is when nobody knows where else to send a problem that seems to have worked its way through the system, and they've got to get it handled, you end up with it. And so the chief of staff sits there with that particular problem, knowing usually where the leader, the premier, the prime minister wants the direction to go, but has to try to figure out how the pieces are all going to be brought together. And usually, but not always, it can be a problem like a scandal, or it can be a problem of a lack of attention to detail in a policy matter or whatever it is, but it blows up in your face. And those are the ones that governments usually get judged on in the end.
Peter, how do you know when you have to be the fixer and clean up a scandal, how much to tell the boss?
Well, I mean, first, being a fixer doesn't necessarily mean that you're always involved in a scandal. Sometimes being a fixer is just dealing with people. I mean, this business that we're in, at the end of the day, is about people. And there's a lot of people involved, and it's a big team, and they're not jobs for people. This is a cause. Everyone's in part of a cause, so they hold these things very, very close and hard and emotionally to themselves. And so it's about trying to get these people to sort of say, okay, how are we going to move together, even though we're not? And so a lot of the times, and sometimes it's about talking to people, things that have gone wrong, and so you got to help them. I think on the issue of what do people need to know and when, government is very big. It's extremely complex, not unlike big business. And not every decision that has to be made goes up to the CEO of a large corporation.
And CEO being the premier in this case.
Yeah, the CEO being the premier in this case. You pay people to make other decisions, and what you really are also paying them for more than anything else is the judgment to know what should they be able to handle and what is so important, what is so strategic to the operation of the government and to the government getting its agenda done, that it needs to go to the premier, just like when you're in business. What needs to go to the CEO? It's exactly the same.
Hugh Segal, could you give us an example of either Mr. Mulrooney or Mr. Davis where you had to play fixer and you had to have one of those look very hard in the mirror moments? Do I tell them or don't I tell them?
Well, I'll tell you one that I was glad to do and didn't give the details to the Prime Minister. We were dealing with the Charlottetown Accord being reviewed by a committee chaired by the Honorable Jean Charest. There were some difficulties within the Conservative Party at the time, as you'll recall, with Mr. Bouchard and others. Very important that the amendments to the Accord be passed constructively, and there were one or two recalcitrant members from our caucus on that, and my job was to get that passed, and I went to have a chat with the recalcitrant members to get a sense of what were the issues that were grinding them. And in the case of one, who shall remain nameless, from a Quebec constituency, the issue was his riding desperately needed an old people's home. And there wasn't an old people's home, a senior's residence of any kind, and it was very unfair, and he couldn't make any progress with the Quebec government to make that happen. And I said to him, well, if I can facilitate an old people's home, no benefit for him individually or particularly for the party, but for the people in his riding, could I count on his support on these matters? And the response I got was positive. And then I, through dealing with my colleagues in Premier Barrassa's office, was able to find a way to find an old people's home that would show up in his constituency in a reasonable period of time, in a fashion that allowed him to say, I fought hard to get an old people's home for my riding. Now, did I get into the details of that with my Prime Minister? No. I didn't want to impose upon his relationship with Monsieur Bourassa, which was important for other reasons. But it didn't strike me as unreasonable that an MP would want to get something of great service to his own constituents and was using the leverage that he may have had in this process to try to have that happen. And those are the sorts of things where you would not actually report on the details to your First Minister, but you would facilitate it in a fashion that was lawful, constructive, in the public interest, and produce the right result for your country.
And did Brian Mulroney ever, some years down the road, ask you, hey, how did we get that guy's vote anyway?
No, he did not. He was very good at dispatching someone to do something, trusting that person to do it in an ethical and responsible way, and not asking for great detail himself.
Gotcha. David Lindsay, fixer. What did you do?
I prefer to take it in an angle of how to help fix things that are in the public good, problems that happen with between cabinet ministers and trying to broker compromises happens all the time. But the two examples that come to mind for me in our first couple of months in power, we had a fall economic statement and reduced the budget quite considerably. One of the agencies that had depended on a considerable amount of funding was Caribana. And so Caribana was politically sensitive and concerned about cost reductions, but reducing some groups and not other groups was not seen to be fair. So we agreed we'd reduce everyone accordingly. And I was dispatched to actually go and sit down with some of the staff at the Caribana operation and see if there's a way we could do some private sector fundraising to help backfill the money that was not forthcoming from the government. So being able to help people in a difficult circumstance, being able to help fix a problem is one of the positive ways of I was able to contribute to the job. We had another example of a controversy in the Niagara Escarpment Commission. They'd approved a development which went to Cabinet. Cabinet decided that they did not want to see this development take place on the Niagara Escarpment Commission. And again, I was dispatched to go down and speak with the developer involved and explain the decision of Cabinet and of the government of the day. So being a fixer is not always connected to a political scandal. Being a fixer is actually part of what we do in government.
And I presume, Peter, that when people talk to you, they assume they're talking to Dalton McGuinty. Is that right?
Oh yeah. I mean, they assume that they're talking to Dalton McGuinty, and if for the job to really work well, that has to be true. I mean, you have to know your boss, and your boss has to know you, and people have to have confidence in that, and they have to know that. And I have to, I was very lucky during my time with Premier McGuinty. I always felt that I had his back and he had mine.
And I've been there when I did something by mistake that the Premier Peterson wasn't very happy about.
What was it?
And I'm trying to remember. I just remember the tongue lashing that I got afterwards for a commitment or a promise that I made that I shouldn't have made. And that's the knife's edge. The knife's edge for all of this, Peter said it well about judgment. The knife's edge is, I'm not an elected official. I'm not the head of the public service. I'm someone that the premier of the day has put trust in, but I'm accountable to him, but I don't have the other accountabilities formally. Certainly legally and ethically I do, but not formally to the people who elected me or something like that. And I have to know my place in all of this. So my place is that I am an unelected official. I am somebody who's giving advice, and I have to respect the fact that in the end, it is the Premier's decision and the others who are going to be elected in the cabinet and others. And I have to be able to convey that message to the people that I'm dealing with, that I can be a faithful recorder of their issues, that I can advance their case in a fair way, but in the end, I'm not the Premier.
Yeah, and I think it's important, if I can use that, you know, to go back to something that Hugh Segal said earlier about, you know, the second most powerful man in Ottawa and stuff like that. I mean, our jobs, we're advisors. That's really, we advise people, and it's the Premier of the day or the cabinet of the day that make the decisions. That's what they got elected to do, not us.
But they make decisions based on the information that they get from you. And if you present the information in a way which suggests you have a dog in the hunt, that's why people don't like you guys, right? Because you're the gatekeepers.
But interestingly, Steve, I would say in terms of Mr. Davis's Ontario, there was not a uni-channel hierarchy that controlled all the access. People would know in Bill Davis's case that on some issues he might be getting his advice from Sally Barnes, who was our communications director. On others, he might be getting it from Claire Westcott, who had been a long-time former lineman for Ontario Hydro, worked his way up through the government, knew everybody everywhere. He might be getting it from Ed Stewart, who was, God rest his soul, one of the great public servants of our time, who rose from Kennedy Collegiate in Windsor all the way through the education department to be the deputy minister to the cabinet. And in some cases, if it was a political matter, he might be getting advice from me. And they all knew that all of us came second to the senior ministers of the Crown. And I think one of the ways you preserve a Premier First Minister's flexibility is not to have it appear as if he or she is captive of any one channel. They have to be seen to be open to a series of channels from which they and their colleagues then make appropriate decisions. And what one can do perhaps as a chief is to ensure that the channels are open and that they are not closed artificially at the precise time when access to that information is vital to the First Minister making a good decision.
David, if there are, sorry, one second, Herschel, I want to go to David on this. If there are many channels to the top, does that threaten the power base of the Chief of Staff, who may want to be the one and the last guy in the room with the Prime Minister or the Premier?
I don't think anybody on this panel would fit into that category. I actually valued the assurance that I knew the Premier that I worked for was checking with many different people and had different lines of input. I remember some of the phrases he would use. I used to love to write speeches. It was not as good as Hugh, but I enjoyed doing it. And Mike would quite often cross out whole paragraphs, and he would use lines like, if I don't talk that way in the Legion Hall in North Bay, why would I talk that way in the Ontario legislature? So he made sure he tried to stay connected and had lots of lines of communications coming in, and that actually gave me a sense of comfort that he was connected. The flip side of your question, being the last person in the room that has to give that hard, sober advice. Peter Wilkinson talked about asking his boss to step aside pending an investigation. That's actually not a position any of us, I won't speak for the rest of them, but I was never comfortable being in, though I had occasion to have to do it. I preferred to actually know that he already intuitively knew what needed to be done because he tested all the waters and I was helping to facilitate and deliver as opposed to having to correct his perceptions.
Gotcha. We're going down Herschel Ezrin's list of the 5 F's here, the 5 F's being the 5 functions of a Chief of Staff. Filter, facilitator, fixer. Let's do number 4 now, the face What do you mean by that?
Well, we've all been talking about it, and that is that there are many occasions where you can't divide a premier or prime minister in multiple pieces, but somebody needs to see them or their representative at a particular event or a particular activity. Sometimes it can be a cabinet minister, but sometimes, particularly in private meetings and in activities where groups felt that they wanted a private kind of discussion, it turned out more often than not to be you, sometimes with a minister as well, but sometimes not. And often it was better for us to be the first line of defense in some of these issues where we could have some of these discussions. People knew that we were going to report faithfully exactly what they thought, and then we could have a chance to huddle together and caucus on exactly how we might handle some of the demands that they were going to make. But they needed to know that they had that face and that representative to deal with.
Okay. And sorry, Peter, you wanted to add?
No, I would say that. I mean, quite often, groups are having an issue and they want something. They'll want to see the chief of staff, particularly if they find at times that as they're dealing with the government, they don't feel like they're being heard by ministries or by the bureaucracy and things like that. And they want to get that in, and you take those meetings and you hear, and sometimes what people say is right. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes our folks were getting it wrong, and you can sort of help facilitate and be the face that sort of say, okay, well, let's help that get together.
There's another element in this, though, and that is that people look at you because they know that you have access, and this is in a world where access counts, whether it's getting the best health care or anything else. Access in the political vein is very important, and they know that you don't have to make an appointment and wait 3 days to get in to see the premier.
You see him whenever you want, basically.
Well, you have that chance. You don't abuse the privilege, but you can if you had to.
Okay. The last F on the list is focus. And Hugh Segal, I want to go to you first on this, because one of the reasons we have convened this gathering of former chiefs of staff is because we have a situation in the nation's capital today where a Government of Canada, I'm trying to remember now, a $250 billion corporation, essentially, which is the Government of Canada, is being preoccupied by $90,000. A $250 billion corporation is being completely overrun by $90,000. And I want to know, Senator Segal, how a chief of staff keeps the team focused when Rome is burning. How do you do it?
Well, the first thing I think that a chief of staff has to do is sometimes be the bearer of bad news. A chief of staff who just agrees with everything the First Minister says or believes or advances is not doing his job. He or she has to be able to push back, and that means he or she has to say, if I lose my job, pushing back, that's better than keeping my job by not leveling about how difficult a circumstance may be. So the challenge in these circumstances is to separate out, if you wish, those issues which run right to the core of how a First Minister and government are going to be perceived, are being perceived, and what has to be done to address that, from those issues which may be interesting but a touch extraneous. That's not easy to do in the heat of battle. I'm not suggesting that it is, but one of the things a Chief of Staff has to do in collaboration with his or her colleagues on staff, the press secretary, the senior clerk of the cabinet, and various others, is give a clear and focused assessment. This also happens, by the way, when a government is dispatching troops as part of a NATO operation, or there is a serious loss of Canadian forces abroad in some military activity, and the entire screen fills with the huge emotional and justified impact from that kind of tragedy. That's where a Chief of Staff, I think, earns his or her pay by arguing for the kind of clarity and focus which is absolutely essential, which means you cannot deal with every piece of the issue with an equal amount of time and focus. You do have to make some choices, and a Chief of Staff's primary role in that kind of context, Steve, is to fundamentally help with the shaping of those priorities.
David, let me go to you in Ottawa on this one and recall the days when there were hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets of this province protesting your government's agenda, Mr. Harris's government's agenda, let me call it that. And no doubt you were taking incoming on all sides. Can you give us an example of how you maintain focus under those circumstances?
In executing on any plan, whether it's a military operation, as Hugh was saying, or delivering on a government agenda, or just constructing a cottage, you have to have first the blueprint on what you're trying to do. Let's call that the strategy. And then you need to have the tactical capability to deliver it. And then you need to be able to communicate and tell the story. In government and politics, communications is the coin of the realm, so to speak. And what quite often would happen in the first couple of years of the Harris administration is people would ask us to explain the strum and the noise rather than tell the story about what we were constructing. So if you're building a cottage or building an extension or redecorating your apartment, the explaining the dust and the noise is always more difficult to do than explaining what the outcome is you're trying to accomplish. So the way we tried to maintain focus during the implementation of the Common Sense Revolution was to remind people what we got ourselves into in terms of the fiscal situation and what we were trying to deliver at the conclusion of the implementation of the Common Sense Revolution. So the communications was an important component of maintaining focus. The strategy needed to be there, the tactical execution, and then explain, explain, explain.
Peter, how about for Dalton McGuinty? Can you give us an example of how you, in the midst of some major catastrophe, had to keep him and the government focused?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's part of the issue with being in government is that there's every day there's something coming on. You know, there's the wave is coming to the shore, right? You go into government, you say, here's what we want to get done. And then you open the newspapers every day or you watch the agenda and suddenly your day is different than you thought it was going to be, and it's going to ruin your week and some days your month. And so what you have to be able to do particularly is sort of say, okay, we need to fight this fire, but we've got some things we got to get done and we need to get them done. And so, you know, from my perspective, what we would do at times is that, and I was really lucky, I had great people that I worked with in Premier McGuinty's office, other staff that were really very bright, very smart, really knew what they were doing. We would sort of hive off some people and sort of say, okay, if we have this crisis, you're dealing with this crisis. Everybody else, your job is to keep the government working on a day-to-day basis and keep moving our long-term agenda down. Because if you don't do that, then all you do is you end up dealing with the crisis of the day. And that's when people start to think maybe your government has some drift to it.
Well, that's what I wonder, Herschel. Can governments walk and chew gum at the same time, which is essentially what you're saying, Peter? They got to put out fires and...
But it is a big challenge. And one of the jobs of a chief of staff is working in the field of allocation of resources, as Peter said. But there is a very important other partner that we have in this whole thing, and we've mentioned it sort of peripherally through this whole discussion. And that's called either the Secretary to Cabinet or the Clerk of the Privy Council, the senior-most public servant who sits in on many of these meetings as well, doesn't get involved in the politics of everything, but certainly has to know how the public service is going to run. And you see them as partners in this whole exercise. So in addition to the great staff of research and press and others that you collect for the political side of this, you have to be able to engage and work with the public service, which is, after all, going to be responsible for doing most of the work, most of the analysis, most of the service delivery, and you're trying to provide them the leadership on the political agenda. So when I use the word focus in all of this, what I'm talking about is making sure that all of those different elements keep working and that we don't get paralysis while we focus only on the subject of the day, as it were be.
Okay, we've gone through the list of the 5 Fs, and I want to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, right now, can you put up a 4-shot? I'd like to see all 4 of our guests at the same time right now, because I want to ask each of them a question. There we go. I want to know if any 4 of you, because I want to understand this relationship with your First Minister better, has any 4 of you ever got into a shouting match with your First Minister? Anybody?
Yes?
Yes? No?
No.
David Lindsay's smiling, Hugh Segal's shaking his head. All right, let me start with the guy who said yes. Herschel, you got into a shouting match with David Peterson?
Yeah,
what happened?
Because I believe that on a particular issue, he was being particularly dogmatic. He believed that of me as well. And this didn't happen very often, but we had a very significant disagreement, not on a scandal or anything like that, but on an issue of policy where I really believed, as Hugh said, if he didn't expect me to be in the room to actually give him my opinion, then I shouldn't be there.
And how did you resolve it?
We resolved it the way we resolved everything else. We kept talking. And eventually, I lost the argument, by the way. But eventually,
well, that's the nature of the game, right?
Yeah, but I felt that I had been heard, and I felt that it was important enough because of the commitments we'd made as a government that I wanted to at least take this stand. Now, it wasn't a shouting match where we were using abusive language or something like that. Well, if you worked with David Peterson, then you had a good education in profanity. But the thing was that you were still in a situation where there was tremendous respect in the room, and believe me, it's when I addressed him as Premier instead of as David, because I always called him Premier in public. Privately, I would call him David, but in this case, it was Premier in the entire discussion.
Okay, speaking of David, I want to know why David Lindsay smiled there when I said, have you ever had a shouting match with Mike Harris? Because Mr. Harris has, I think, a somewhat legendary temper around Queen's Park. So go ahead, tell the story.
Mike and I worked together for many years, and what would quite often happen, I think Peter Wilkinson probably knows the geography of the 6th floor of the Whitney block better than anybody else on the panel tonight. The Premier's corner office is on the south west wing of the 6th floor, and the Chief of Staff is immediately adjacent. And there's 2 doors that go into the Premier's office and go into the Chief of Staff's office. But there's also a little corridor in between the 2. So if we ever had meetings, we would always go through the front door of the Premier's office and meet with staff or meet with delegations or officials. But if there was a problem and we needed to have a private conversation, what I would tend to do is I would go in through the back door. And I think that became a signal between the 2 of us that we were having a different kind of conversation.
Okay. But it wasn't an argument. It was just a different kind of conversation.
I want to ask a follow-up to Hugh Siegel on this. Brian Mulroney's government was incredibly unpopular at one point. He was I think he was in the low teens in popularity. And I wonder if there were ever moments where you had to go into that Prime Minister's office and, I don't know, paint the picture for me. Do you ever have to put your arm around the guy and sort of buck him up because he's so low?
Well, first of all, your reference to the low teens is very charitable. When I joined his staff in 1991, we were at 7.8% in the polls, which meant that at that point in Canada, more Canadians thought Elvis Presley was alive than planned to vote for us. We were in pretty desperate shape. Interestingly enough, though, when he asked me to come and join his staff, he said, you have 3 priorities and 3 priorities only. First, because of the failure of Meech Lake and the Quebec government's decision to have a referendum on independence, which, by the way, the independent side would have won, they're running at about 70%, your first job is to get the bullet out of that gun, spend all your time to make sure we get through that with the country safe and intact. Get the ship to shore, the children and women off, number 1. Number 2, we've got to rebuild the Progressive Conservative Party at 7% in the polls. We are in some difficulty. And number 3, you have to tell me at a point that will be clear and precise when it's time for me to go. I want your advice on that issue, but my question comes third and last after the other 2. So I had a very clear hierarchy of responsibility as defined by him, and therefore I could pursue each of those issues in a way that allowed me to be frank and direct and supportive. I can give you, if I may, another example of how that worked and the kind of human being Mulroney was. We are flying back from the last rally in favor of the Charlottetown Accord, the referendum, and this was the last rally right on the border of Saskatchewan and Alberta. And we have been told as we're flying back, it was a very emotional rally, Ministers of the Crown, First Nations chiefs, very, very emotional, enthusiastic. We get on the plane and we are told very clearly by our pollsters that we are in deep doo-doo and we are not going to win tomorrow. I hand that note to the Prime Minister. He looks at it and I said, Prime Minister, with that note, you must have my resignation. I was the senior political officer on this, working on your behalf. We are going to fail tomorrow. It's my job to walk the plank. I'm delighted to do so. Small price to pay for the privilege to have served. He looked out the window, I'd say for about 10 minutes, and he said, look out the window, Huey. That is one of the most wonderful vistas you're going to see and the greatest country in the world. It is not so fragile that it can't withstand a referendum where many of our fellow Canadians vote no. The sun will rise the next morning and the country will go on, and I will not accept your resignation because no one worked harder than you could have in the role that you were discharging. And so that process works both ways when you have a close relationship with the First Minister whom you respect. Certainly this was the kind of First Minister who would know when to reach out and call people who are going through the most difficult part of their life or their career to give them a little bit of encouragement and to cheer them up, something which I think was one of his great, great strengths and why his caucus stayed so loyal at 7% right to the end of his time as Prime Minister.
I want to follow up on one element of that story, though, which is, in some respects, Peter, like a hockey coach or a baseball manager, the minute you are hired, you are cannon fodder, right? You are expecting, presumably, to be thrown under the bus, if necessary, to protect your boss. Is that right?
Sure. Absolutely.
And you accept the job under those premises?
Absolutely, accept the job under those premises, but at the same time, I had a condition on the other side, which was the Premier, which was that, you didn't have to take my advice, but you had to let me get it out, let me say it to you. You decide, and he always kept his word on that, and fortunately, I was never thrown under the bus.
Now, Steve, you've got to understand, this is the greatest job that you could ever have.
Why?
Because you have the opportunity to influence the agenda for your country, for your province, and you have a chance to be able to do things and to raise issues in the corridors of power, in ministries and other places, to bring legitimate cases of people's needs forward and to try to see if you can facilitate or fix the problems for them. Why wouldn't you want to do this? Yes, that's the price is that you could be cannon fodder at some point, but what a ride before then.
Oh, it's tremendous. There's no better place to be. It's a fabulous place to be. I mean, you can go home every night and know that you have done something. It could be a small thing, but every day you have done something to make life better for somebody in this province, somewhere. It's a great, you don't get that anywhere else.
But I wonder about the disconnect on that, because the public probably doesn't see it that way. The public probably thinks quite differently, right? That you guys are in there doing whatever, right?
Well, but wait a moment. I don't disagree with you, Steve. And the question is, why do they believe that? I think because, if I may say so,
Please.
The narrative around politics in the last period of time, and last 10 years perhaps, is about manipulation and pollsters and spinmeisters and tactics, and it kind of, all of which happens. It's been happening since Sir John A. Macdonald did his political picnics to get reelected in the late 1800s. But the truth of the matter is that most of the people who get into public life are there because they want a better education system. They want to strengthen Canada's defense. They want to build our relationship in terms of trading with all of North America. They want to build a better healthcare system. They want to create universal healthcare. I mean, those are the things that have come out of our political system, various parts of Canada, and the notion that it's all about manipulation and it's all about deceit and it's all about spinmeisters is, in my view, an unfair characterization, but it's hard, and I'm not blaming anybody. I'm sure some of this has been, in fact, generated by folks who like to portray themselves as doing that so successfully for the party or government of their choice. But the truth of the matter is we do lose the thread, the core of why good people leave law practices and farms and their positions as teachers and small business people to get into public life. And the vast majority get in because they want to make a difference in the time they have on this planet.
So, David Lindsay, are we just all watching too much of House of Cards these days? Is that the problem?
I think the individuals who stop and reflect on what's happening and see the benefits of what individual politicians and the system delivers for them understand it. But that, dog bites man, is not a story. Man bites dog is an interesting story. Selling newspapers and telling stories that are scintillating and interesting goes a lot further than the trains arrived on time today, no babies were dropped in any maternity wards today, children learned their alphabet today. All the good things that we depend on in government are not news.
Okay, I got just a few minutes left here. In our last few minutes, let me put this on the table. Was there ever a moment where the Premier or Prime Minister came to one of you and said, I need you to do this, and you just looked at him and said, no, I'm not going to do it. It's a wrong thing to do. You're going to have to fire me before I do that. Hugh Segal?
It was never that intense. There would be times when I would be asked to engage in a particular way, and I would probably say, look, I'm not the right guy for that. I'm not going to have the impact that you want, and I don't think that's the best way to proceed. Then either the First Minister would go to someone else to address it, or the First Minister would reflect on whether he still wanted to see that happen. But that was very, very rare. Most of the time it would be ministers of the Crown who wanted the Premier or the Prime Minister to do something that was blunt and tough and insensitive, and I became the proposed agent, and I would be very careful about whether or not that was the sort of thing I was prepared to do, and I would seek the support of the First Minister in that process.
Peter, did you ever go to Dalton McGuinty and say, nope, can't do that for you, sorry?
Well, like Hugh, dealing with Premier McGuinty, he would want something, or we want to go down a certain way, and I'd say, well, actually, I have a different opinion. I think we should do it this way, and we would talk about that, and we might bring in some other people to do it, or to think about how the conversation goes. I mean, I think the great thing about these jobs is that quite often you're trying to get the Premier McGuinty used to say, two heads are better than one, and so and three occasionally is better than two, and stuff like that.
David Lindsay, did Mike Harris ever tell you to go fire a cabinet minister and you didn't want to do it?
No. But Mike and I had worked together for a long time before we went into the Premier's office, so we knew each other, and we knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. We understood each other's philosophy. So Mike is actually a very good people person, and he understood what my strengths were and what my weaknesses were. So he wouldn't ask me to do something that, to pick up on Hugh's point, that wasn't using my skill set. And so we actually had a great working relationship. I don't think I was in that awkward situation. We had many awkward situations we had to deal with, but I was not put in that awkward
Steve, there was a point at which, however, where I think each one of us got to that point where we said, okay, is our batting average on advice 300? Is it 250? Is it beneath that? And if it is consistently beneath that on a series of important issues, should we be staying on? And I did reach that point in roughly April of 1993, where my batting average had fallen to beneath 250, and it occurred to me that the Prime Minister had the right to a new advisor, and I had the right to get back to my life at Queen's and Kingston. So that is the reversing the telescope, but it's not a dissimilar proposition.
Herschel Ezrin, last word to you on this.
Well, I think, again, I was fortunate that I worked with David Peterson in opposition. And it's a tremendously disciplining fact to be in an opposition leader's office when you have no resources, when nobody's interested in the media and whatever you have to say or anything else. And so you cherish those moments when you actually can create the government's policy and everything else. But we had a chance to work together, and I have enormous respect for him then, and I still do. And I knew that David Peterson would always ask me for what my opinions were, but he also did the right thing.
That's why they call them the deciders. You advise, they decide. I want to thank all four of our former chiefs of staff for joining us today and helping peel back the curtain just a little bit. Hugh Segal, the former chief of staff to Brian Mulroney and William Davis. David Lindsay, the former chief of staff to Premier Mike Harris. Herschel Ezrin, the former chief of staff to Premier David Peterson. Peter Wilkinson, former chief of staff to Premier Dalton McGuinty. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.